Hi, and welcome back to the Unseen Podcast, a podcast dedicated to missing people, unresolved cases, and UK true crime. We've got just a little bit of housekeeping before we get started with today's episode. I just wanted to give you a quick update about CrimeCon. We're all still hoping that the June date will be going ahead. However, we know that COVID has its own agenda, so there's a possibility that it might not do. With that in mind, CrimeCon has put out a new date of the 25th and 26th of September, so if you're thinking about coming or already have tickets, pencil that date into your diaries. I can't wait to see everyone regardless of when it goes ahead, and remember you can still use my code UNSEEN for 10% off your tickets. I also wanted to let you know that in 2021 I want to showcase as many UK true crime podcasts as I can. There are so many great ones out there, and I'm happy to be part of this amazing community. Every so often you might hear a different voice reading out our usual disclaimer. This week we've got Mark from the podcast Seeing Red. Their info will be in the show notes if you don't already listen. This week we're going to be exploring the mysterious and strange murder of Ron Cousins in Chelmsford in Essex. The senseless murder of an elderly man shook the market town and changed the way that the community there lived. Despite the fact that such a violent crime had been committed, his murder still remains unsolved.
This episode contains descriptions that some listeners may find distressing, so listener discretion is advised.
Moulsham is located in the city of Chelmsford in Essex. Chelmsford is just 30 miles from central London and is part of the commuter belt around the capital. It has a slower pace and has a variety of shops, offices and churches. Old Moulsham is an area of the suburb, and it was where number 5 Anchor Road was located. Local residents and neighbours in the area knew that this is where Ron Cousins lived. He had lived there his entire life, and the house had stayed in the family. Ron's mother had lived there before him. He was known in the area as a friendly and pleasant man. For many people in Moulsham, this was all that they knew about Ron, and he was simply a friendly face in the neighbourhood. That was until Friday, April the 15th, 1994. Neighbours of Ron's had noticed that water from an overflow pipe at the back of his house was splashing and making lots of noise. This was unusual, and the neighbours also noticed that Ron's curtains had been drawn each time that they looked at his house. This was so unlike Ron, and something seemed wrong about it. A couple who had noticed what had been going on at Ron's house, Paul and Phyllis Nestor, decided to go over and see how he was. They entered in the back of the house, where they found the back door open. As they entered Ron's home, they discovered the house had been completely overturned. Rooms appeared to have been ransacked, with Ron's belongings strewn all over the floor. When they went further into the house, they also found that a tap was still running in the bathroom, and the bath was overflowing with water, which was spilling all over the floors of the house. This was a very alarming and strange scene. However, it was when the couple entered the living room that they got the biggest shock. Ron's body lay lifeless in the middle of the room, and he was covered in white paint. It was clear that he had been attacked, as he had wounds and injuries to his back, neck, and chest. A red, quite raw-looking ligature mark was also noticeable around Ron's neck. This was a huge shock for the couple, and they immediately contacted police to come out to his home. Officers from Essex Police travelled out to the house and were greeted with the same strange scene that Paul and Phyllis Nestor had already experienced. Upon examination of Ron's body, police discovered a knife lay on top of him. However, when this knife was looked at more closely, it was found not to be the weapon that had caused the stab wounds. This was an odd feature, because why had the killer placed a knife that wasn't used on Ron's body? Had it been to confuse detectives? The paint that covered Ron's body was also strange, and detectives took samples of it to further analyse. There didn't seem to be any good reason why Ron was covered in it, and it further confused the already hectic scene. One of the most bizarre features of the murder was what police found in Ron's mouth. Paper was found stuffed into his mouth, and when it was analysed, it was found to be pages from a Bible. This was a key part of the investigation, and like most of the scene, appeared to be unnecessary. It was almost as though the scene had been staged, and much of the damage to the house seemed almost pointless. Police looked into the idea that Ron may have been burgled, and that this was a robbery gone wrong. However, there was a problem with this theory. Detectives discovered £700 that had been hidden away in the oven, which had not been taken. If the robber had searched as well as it appeared that they had, they probably would have found the money and taken it. However, it was still there. This didn't mean that it definitely was not a robbery. However, the damage to the house also didn't make sense if this was the case. Neither did the almost stage-like appearance of Ron's body. Why would someone take the time after killing Ron to do all this? Detectives looked closely at Ron's life in an effort to understand what might have compelled someone to do this. What they found, however, gave police no more understanding about the crime. Ron was liked by everyone that they spoke to in the neighbourhood, and was known as a lovely and friendly man. He had lived there his entire life, except during the Second World War, where he was a medic in India. After the war ended, however, he returned home to Anchor Road and began working as a milkman. He was also a religious man who was heavily involved with the churches in Moulsham. He attended several of them, Christ Church United Reformed Church and Elim Church being just two of them. He also regularly visited the Salvation Army. He was a kind man who took in people who didn't have much, and regularly allowed homeless people to stay with him until they found somewhere to go. Those who knew Ron in the community were shocked and appalled about what had happened to him. A journalist from Chelmsford talking about Ron's murder stated, "I think everyone was shocked at the time. We put it on the front page of both the weekly and evening gazette. Chelmsford was a very safe and carefree place. It probably changed the way we went about our daily lives." The community as well as the police couldn't understand why this had happened, and they were horrified that it had occurred in their neighbourhood. The scene was such a brutal one that the police were determined that they needed to track down the person responsible as soon as possible. During their conversations with neighbours and residents, they tried to find any witnesses or people who had seen something important in the days leading up to Ron's murder. They spoke to hundreds of people about Ron and his movements and lifestyle, and each time they struggled to understand why someone would want him dead. He was by all accounts an unassuming man who loved to help others and believed that it was important to do so. Lines of inquiry that the police followed were the items that had been left at Ron's house. These included the knife that wasn't the murder weapon that had been left on his torso, and the paint that he had been covered in. There were also the pages from the Bible that had been stuffed into his mouth. These were, without doubt, the most unusual parts of the murder, and were items not usually left at crime scenes. The police set about trying to identify where the paint had come from and if it was relevant to the murder. Detective Inspector Stuart Truss explained in 2018 that they did try to track down where the paint was from and whether it was from Ron's home or had been brought by the murderer. He stated, "Was there significance behind that? Was the person a painter and decorator?" This was an interesting idea given that Ron lived alone. Someone had had to enter the house, and it may have been possibly for this reason. In later years, a neighbour of Ron's would make a statement explaining that he had seen the paint in Ron's house before the murder. However, this has not been officially commented on by Essex police. The Bible pages were of extreme interest to detectives, who examined them closely. There may be significance to the particular pages that were put in Ron's mouth. However, if there is, the police are keeping this close to their chest, and have said that they do not want to divulge too much about this piece of evidence. This could possibly be in the hope that if they do find the perpetrator, they will know something about this, and this would confirm if they did have something to do with the murder. The investigation initially moved very quickly, with 2 people being questioned just the day after Ron's body was found. His house had been searched thoroughly for fingerprints, and they worked diligently to identify everyone who had been in there. A 16-year-old boy and a 32-year-old man were questioned following this search, and this was welcome news as it appeared that the police may have had reason to believe that they had something to do with it. After this questioning, however, neither person was arrested for Ron's murder. However, interestingly, the 32-year-old man was arrested on charge of burglary. Not just any burglary, but he was charged with stealing from Ron, just 6 weeks before he was killed. Once again, like many aspects of this case, the police have not gone into detail about what this means, or what was possibly stolen from Ron. However, it does suggest that he may have been targeted more than once in the weeks leading up to his death. If this had been a robbery, however, whoever had committed it had not known about the £700 hidden in the oven, which may imply that they didn't know Ron that well to know his hiding places. There is of course also the possibility that Ron had changed where he put his important possessions following the previous robbery. Following this initial apparent progress on the case, the investigation seemed to come to a halt, with little new evidence being presented. In December 1994, Ron's case was featured on Crime Watch, with a reconstruction of the day and what police knew about the murder. This did provide the public with a little more information about what had happened to him. Detectives were able to establish that on Friday, April the 15th, Ron had visited the market at around 10 a.m. This was usual for him, and he was well known in the community and with many of the market traders. He had several conversations with people there, and many remembered seeing him. After he left the market, he then went to the Christchurch Day Centre, one of the churches that Ron frequented regularly. One of the ladies who worked there remembered him fondly and said that he would often go for his dinner and to speak to the other people who visited. This was a normal day and trip for him, and those that worked there described him as always happy. He then travelled back towards his house. It was at around 4:40 that evening that another witness spotted Ron on Anchor Street, close to his house. A witness, Julie, worked on Anchor Street in one of the offices. She left the office to go to the post box and noticed Ron crossing the street. She struck up a conversation with him, and then she watched as he headed down the back alley to the rear of his house. This seemed to be the last time that anyone saw Ron, and it was some time later that he would be murdered. While it was not known what Ron did that night, his routine meant that he normally read the Bible and watched TV. At around 9:30 p.m. that night, one of Ron's neighbours 2 doors down from him heard someone knocking on Ron's door. The witness was annoyed by this as he was getting up early the next day to go on a trip to France, and he wanted to get some sleep. The knocking stopped not long afterwards, and he went to sleep. He woke up the next morning in the early hours, and along with his wife they left the house. But as they did so, they heard the pipe at the back of Ron's house gushing out. They noticed that this was odd, however continued about their plans. At around 10:30 a.m. on the 16th of April, 2 more neighbours spotted that Ron's curtains were still drawn, and it was these neighbours who entered his house and found him lifeless in the living room. These witnesses established that Ron may well have had a visitor late that night. However, there were further witnesses who spotted something strange on Anchor Street on the 15th. Just before 6 p.m. that evening, a man named Peter Morgan left work to go to the gym, which was located on Anchor Street. As he arrived at the gym at around 5:45 p.m, he noticed a man stood in the street. He was slightly built with long hair, and Peter noticed that when he looked at him, the man looked away as though not wanting to be seen. Peter left the gym at around 8:10 that evening, and saw that the man was still hanging around, this time around 100 yards from Ron's house. A description was put together, with the man reportedly wearing a cream bomber-style jacket and looking a little scruffy. Peter was not the only witness to see the same man in the street. Another woman who was taking her daughter to a German lesson on Anchor Street about half an hour after Peter saw him the first time, also saw a man hanging around. He was stood outside Ron's house at around 6:20 p.m. and appeared to fit the same description as the man that had been seen earlier. After dropping her daughter off, the woman went back down Anchor Street and saw the man again, still stood outside Ron's house, but this time looking up at his bedroom window. These sightings were important and put this man within the vicinity of Ron's house, and even showing interest in it, particularly his bedroom. Did this man have anything to do with the murder, or was it just a coincidence that he was stood where he was? During the Crime Watch appeal, Detective Superintendent Ivan Dibley was asked about his theory about what happened. He stated from what he had found, Ron didn't have any enemies, and they couldn't find anyone that would want to harm him. He did, however, point out that Ron frequently invited people back to his house, such as people who had nowhere to live or needed some help. He didn't rule out that this is what happened that day, and said it was possible that someone had come round to Ron's house from outside the area. He stated that looking at the crime scene, whoever had been in the home would have been covered in both paint and blood following the murder, and that this person would have stood out. He also appealed to anyone who may have seen the man in Anchor Street to come forward, or the man himself to be eliminated. The description of the man was discussed. He was in his early 20s, around 5'8" or 5'9", was slim and had long straight hair. It was clear that the police were looking into the idea that unfortunately it may have been one of the many people that Ron wanted to help that may have been the one that killed him. Detectives were also not clear on the motive. They weren't sure if it was robbery or for more of a personal reason. The unclear motive and the lack of any substantial evidence at the crime scene caused the case to falter again. Following the appeal, there were around 40 calls to police in relation to Ron's case, but sadly they didn't lead anywhere. It was then decided that a reward would be a good way to drum up new leads. A £5,000 reward for information was published, and it was hoped that this would perhaps bring new witnesses out of the woodwork. Like the appeal, however, it didn't lead to new information, and Ron's case was left cold. It's reported that by April 1996, there was just one officer working on the investigation, and the leads had dried up. Over the years, there have been several theories and possible links connected to Ron's murder, one of which was a vicious attack that happened just 5 days after the murder. An attack on clergyman Canon Eric Turner occurred in Toller's Hunt, Darcy, just under 19 miles from Chelmsford. Eric was 82 and had been tied up, gagged and kicked in an attempted robbery at his home. I think that the reason Eric's attack is brought up in relation to Ron's murder is the proximity, and also the possible religious reason. Ron was found with the Bible pages in his mouth, and Eric was a clergyman. The police have commented on this possible connection and have ruled it out, stating that they could not see any links between the cases. Years went by with nothing much being reported on in terms of progress. In 2005, 3 more arrests were made, and these people were questioned in relation to Ron's case. However, they were released without charge. It appeared that Ron's case would stay cold, with little in the way of new evidence being presented. In 2018, Essex police spoke about the case to the BBC, stating that the investigation into Ron's murder is regularly reviewed and the evidence was being regularly tested for DNA with new forensic techniques. It was confirmed that evidence was sent for forensic testing in November of that year. Unfortunately, despite results being found from the testing, it generated no new leads as to who killed Ron. Detective Inspector Liz Truss stated to the BBC that there were several people who had not been ruled out in the investigation, however did not state who these people were. This suggests that the police are still attempting to find suspects, or collate more evidence against them. One of these suspects that has been named is Brian Cutts. It's reported that a former teacher at Chelmsford prison was told by an inmate during a teaching session that they knew who killed Ron Cousins, and it was Brian Cutts. This man was an inmate at the time and has since died. It's believed that he remains a suspect despite his death. Ron's case remains shrouded in mystery. It's so baffling that the scene was left in such disarray, and yet no evidence seems to have been recovered from there. It would seem that whoever had committed the murder would have been covered in both paint and blood, and would have been noticeable in the community. The knife that was left on Ron's torso was also a confusing feature, along with the fact that he had been covered in paint. Why had he been left like this? The Bible pages in his mouth are also strange. Was this done merely as a way of silencing him, and the murderer used the nearest thing to hand? Or was Ron's religion a possible motive for his murder? It's clear that the Bible pages are an important part of the investigation, as the police have not released a lot of information about them, and so may be something that they are holding back until the correct suspect comes along. They may also contain important DNA evidence they do not want to divulge. I think that the fact that Ron allowed strangers into his home regularly is a crucial part of this case, and possibly made him vulnerable to robbery and attack. It's clear that he had become a target with the robbery only 6 weeks before his death, and so it's not such a far-fetched idea. Had this been a robbery that had gone wrong? There is the evidence that someone knocked on his door at around 10 p.m. that night, and the witnesses spotted a man hanging around his house and looking through his windows earlier on. Ron had hidden £700 in his oven, which may suggest that he was worried someone would try and rob him. Ron's case is so sad and unnecessary. Those that knew him have described him as a friendly and happy man who may have also been a little bit lonely. This may be the reason he felt like he wanted to help people who didn't have as much as him, as it also provided him with some company. Tragically, his kindness may have got him killed. Essex police are still looking into the murder and will look into any new information that's given to them. If you know anything about the murder of Ron Cousins in 1994, please contact Essex Police on 101. Thank you for listening to today's episode. Please let me know what you think on social media on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram or YouTube. Thank you as always to my amazing Patreon supporters for everything. And thank you to our newest patrons, Rachel and Danielle. It's so appreciated. If you want extra content, bonus episodes and early ad-free access, the link is in the description. If you'd like to contact me, you can do on social media or at theunseenpod@gmail.com. Please get in touch or leave a review wherever you listen. As always, thanks for listening. I'm Caprice and this has been Unseen.